So Hashtahel, Tuol Gualapu, Tuol Gualapu, Gualapu Daishan, Desaya Chalap, Korina Emmerich Tzitstat, Korina Emmerich Tzitstat, Spoyalapopschad, Ashashel Alta Lenape Hoking. Thank you, Veronica. I'll switch back to English. Whoops, let's go back here. So as there may not be too many Lushootseed speakers here, I'll translate that for you guys. So to all of you, to my friends and to my relatives, my name is Korina Emmerich. I'm from the Puyallup tribe and I live in Lenape-Hoking. And I would like to start off by acknowledging that I currently live on the occupied Canarsie territories in Greater Lenape-Hoking, also known as Brooklyn, New York, and that the majority of the Slow Factory Foundation occupies the ancestral Lenape homelands. I also recognize the continual displacement and violence perpetuated against Indigenous people by settlers, and that violence is not temporarily contained in the arrival of settlers, but is in fact reasserted every single day of occupation. I'd also like to acknowledge the Indigenous people who presently live, work, create, and contribute to our communities here in Lenape-Hoking and worldwide. And I want to start with that information because we have seen this dramatic uptick in the use of the word decolonization. And it's important for me to take action in my practice of decolonization, not only in my language, but the fact that I too am a guest on this territory as my family is originally from the Pacific Northwest Coast Salish territories. So welcome to Fashion and Resistance. This is the 5th class as a part of the Slow Factory Foundation's Open Education 2nd semester programming. And I want to say Hawatub Shalap. Thank you all so much for joining me today. And thank you to the Slow Factory for continuing to host these incredible conversations and communities of support where we are all teachers and we are all students. So today we will be discussing dismantling oppressive systems through culture, history, knowledge, and art, and whether fashion can be used as a medium for social and environmental change at scale, or if we are selling a movement. And we will be discussing fashion choices from the street to the Senate to the runway and more. So the goal of these classes is to spark all of your interest in these ideas and for you all to continue to do research, teach, share, discuss, and dismantle collectively. So I am simply a conduit at this moment to start this conversation. And I am limited by the linear timeline of a single hour. And I am limited by the English language and the confines of my own opinions and experiences. So today I am going to focus on a movement that is currently in my periphery, which is the red dress movement. And rather than trying to tackle a multitude of historical examples, I want to urge everyone to move forward in creating your own platforms as we continue to build our stories of resistance. Because the number of uprisings worldwide are palpable during this significant time of transformation, and fashion is playing a significant role in the way we express ourselves through these movements. And I also want to give a warning to you guys that I will be discussing instances of violence and sexual violence. I will not be going into specific detail, as that would be a disservice to surviving family members. And as I unpack this movement, I also just want to make people aware of the delicate balance between being informative and creating awareness versus co-opting a movement, as these types of movements do arise from significant trauma. Okay, so who am I? Korina Emmerich Tzitstat. My pronouns are she, her. I'm mixed Indigenous Puyallup and white. My work has been referred to as fashion activism, especially recently as Indigenous designers are coming more into mainstream media. And as activism is now becoming just another buzzword, it's still a title that I am uncomfortable with because I don't understand why we have to be called activists when we simply demand just equitable and humane treatment of all living things. But I suppose on somebody else's paper, I am considered to be both a fashion designer and an activist. So although I believe that the fashion industry and activism down to its root do not intersect, I want to unpack those semantics with you all as this class is fashion and resistance. So let's take the word fashion out of industry, okay? So fashion can be used simply as an expression of who we are and what we stand for. And in its simplest form, yes, fashion and activism can go hand in hand quite well. I have said that as designers, we are storytellers, and our clothing is an extension of the nonverbal stories we tell about ourselves, and that fashion is becoming more and more political as a way to express solidarity. So I am a thinker, maker, and critical analyst, and art and design is my form of self-expression. I run my label Emmy Studio from my home here, which is a small, slow fashion label that is focused in direct-to-consumer, made-to-order pieces. I'm centered in social and climate justice and speak often about industry responsibility and accountability. I also serve on the board of directors with the Slow Factory Foundation, where we do work actively to expose and dismantle systems of oppression and white supremacy within the fashion industry and beyond, and challenge colonial ways of thinking. I'm also a member of the Indigenous Kinship Collective, which is a diverse community of Indigenous women, femmes, and gender non-conforming people who gather on Lenape land to honor each other and our relatives through art, direct action, representation, and education. So within the past year, my work has been spotlighted due to the COVID-19 crisis, when in 2019, I originally made a face mask that was designed as a protest commentary on the rise of anti-pipeline demonstrations within our communities and our ongoing fight to protect our land, water, and relatives. Most notable during this time were the anti-pipeline Wet'suwet'en protests, as we organized globally in support of land and water protectors. And the mask was made using scrap fabrics from a coat I had made. But because the face masks were already a part of our ensembles during direct actions in order to halt pipelines being built on Indigenous land. So the split shot face mask was meant to be a fashion statement highlighting the biological warfare and pollution destroying Indigenous lands and our health. And abruptly by March 2020, the mask transformed into protection against this virus. So I want to be clear that I don't believe that any of these facets of my life are separate from each other, and that my work is an amalgamation of lived experiences, as well as rooting into my own histories and drawing from my visual arts background. And I am extremely aware of the possible contradictions and hypocrisy of my work, both in fashion and in activism. So that's really what I want to unpack here today and talk about the juxtaposition between the two. So fashion activism, let's define it. Fashion activism is actually a term coined by Celine Simon, some of you may be familiar with from the Slow Factory. It is noted as being the practice of using fashion as a means of social change, sometimes through ethical consumerism, but often beyond the act of purchasing symbolic fashionable objects. And I am aware that Wikipedia is not a credible academic source, but in this instance, it is our definition, and the Slow Factory is highlighted on this Wikipedia page. So we're going to dive deep into a movement that perfectly represents this synthesis of fashion, solidarity, awareness, and action outside of the idea of consumerism. And that is the red dress movement. So the red dress movement is a call to awareness of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans, and two-spirit people, sometimes also referred to as MMIW, MMIWG, or MMIP. And I will be referring to it in various ways throughout this class, just due to research and quotes. Yeah, I hope you can follow along easily though. So the majority of our class time today will be discussing this particular movement as a case study of resistance, as the haunting presence of one dress in one color hanging empty is an intense visual that expresses solidarity, trauma, awareness, and action through fashion. So the red dress movement started as a public art installation in 2010 called the Red Dress Project by artist Jamie Black, who is an Indigenous Métis artist based in Canada. And it was created in response to the overwhelming number of missing and murdered Indigenous women throughout Indigenous North American communities, both urban and within reservations or reserves. So the color red in many of our communities is thought to be the only color that can be seen by our ancestors, and that by wearing red or the presence of a red dress, we are calling back our taken relatives to give them a voice and bring them justice. Indigenous women face murder rates 10 times the national average, and more than 4 in 5, which means almost all, will experience acts of violence in their lifetime. Homicide is the third leading cause of death of young Indigenous women, and 75% of deaths of Indigenous youth are caused by violence. 96% of Indigenous victims endure violence from non-Native perpetrators. And there are well over 5,700 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, trans, and two-spirit people. And I say well over because the data collected is only accurate through 2016 and has continued to grow at such alarming rates, it's becoming incalculable due to errors, loopholes, lack of communication between state, local, and tribal law enforcement. And while our communities are working to collect data to bring justice to families, the cases often do not include women who are not cisgendered women. But there are now collectives going to work to compile more detailed and inclusive data, including members of the Indigenous Kinship Collective and the Urban Indigenous Collective here in New York. So although I am using statistics, I just want to quickly sidebar and speak primarily to the people of color in class today. As we are all innately aware of the inaccuracies of statistics and how statistics and data are used to continue to marginalize our communities, and also to acknowledge the way that some white people will often use inaccurate statistics to undermine our voices and experiences. Because as we are well aware, many of our communities do not have the luxury of reports and records being cataloged safely, correctly, or accurately. In fact, the Urban Indian Health Institute in so-called Washington State issued a statement demanding more effort from decision makers and law enforcement, stating the report that the Washington State Patrol released in June 2019 is not a proper resource and does nothing to address the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis in Washington State. In fact, it causes harm to our community. They are providing misleading and incorrect information to those who make decisions, write policy, and distribute funding. So Sarah Deer is a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma who works as an attorney and professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies at the University of Kansas, stated, "The history of law enforcement in Indian country has not been necessarily one of protection, but one of persecution. And when you are a Native woman and your sisters and your aunts and your mother and your grandmother and your great-grandmother have all been victims of violence and nobody does anything, why would we come forward?" So when our voices are silenced, we take to the streets. These acts of violence had gone generally unnoticed, unreported, and unsolved for far too long that Indigenous people began to take to the streets in numbers too big to ignore. And the overarching commonality was the color red, creating an intense visual of solidarity. And I also would like to point out that this movement is often referred to in the media as new, but our people have been targeted victims of violence and sexual violence since first contact over 500 years ago. And while the visual symbolism of the red dress has garnered attention in the last 10 years, cases are being pulled into view, it's important to remember that this crisis is simply the continued effort of genocide in this post-colonial society, and is an ongoing example of settler colonial violence that is reasserted every single day of occupation. So Indigenous activists have been organizing protests and vigils relating to missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit individuals for decades, including one of the first Women's Memorial marches that was held on February 14th in 1991 in the downtown Eastside, Vancouver, on Coast Salish territory. So-called British Columbia is notorious for its devastating numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women. So the march started in response to the murder of a local Coast Salish woman, and annual marches are held now on Valentine's Day, February 14th, to commemorate Indigenous women who have been murdered or who have gone missing in order to build awareness and demand action. In 2018, the United States declared May 5th the National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit relatives. And actions are held nationwide to bring awareness and demand justice for cases that are silenced and unsolved. So for you all attending today, please mark your calendars for May 5th. And you can hang a red dress outside as an act of solidarity, or wear red to bring awareness to this issue and share these stories within your community. And if you're based in the US or Canada, you can check in with the people whose land you're living on and see if you can stand in solidarity with actions that are already planned or being held. So this disproportionate rate of assault of Indigenous women is due to a variety of causes, including the historical legal inability of tribes to prosecute on their own reservations. However, when the Federal Violence Against Women Act was reauthorized in 2013, it gave tribes jurisdiction to investigate and prosecute felony domestic violence offenses involving Natives and non-Native offenders on the reservation. But these cases continue to go unreported, and it allows violence and murder to be inaccurately represented in statistical data against Indigenous women, and also allows perpetrators who are often non-Native to go unpunished. So multiple community-led groups are now attempting to collect more accurate data from survivors and surviving family members in order to bring to light the problematic lack of record keeping by law enforcement. So this idea that law enforcement and data collected by law enforcement has our best interests at hand is woefully negated when we discuss the build of man camps on sovereign Indigenous land. And I want to talk about the intrinsic thread between the red dress, pipelines, and police. Indigenous women are targeted. Cases of rape and murder increase rapidly with the construction of man camps built by pipeline workers for resource extraction, which leads directly to the rapid increase in violent crime and sexual violence, including rape, sexual assault of minors, human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking. And from 2006 to 2012, violent victimization known to law enforcement in the Bakken oil producing region of Montana and North Dakota stated the existence of man camps increased violent victimization and aggravated assault by 70%. And again, these are only cases that were reported. So I want to pull two specific examples of the impact of the red dress movement in response to the build of pipelines and the violence perpetuated by police towards Indigenous people. So this is an image of Frida Houston on sovereign Wet'suwet'en territory. She is a Unistoten spokesperson and founder of the Unistoten Healing Center. And on February 10th, 2020, armed Canadian police invaded the territories in order to enforce a court-ordered injunction to push through the Coastal GasLink pipeline, despite the fact that Canada has no ownership or jurisdiction on Wet'suwet'en territory. The raids happened during a ceremony that was being held for our missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. The rows and rows of red dresses were placed to memorialize those who were taken and murdered, many of whom were stolen as a result of the build of these types of pipelines. The women in ceremony continued to drum and sing despite the tactical officers dragging them off their own land. 28 people were arrested by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police during ceremony, including Wet'suwet'en matriarchs Carla Tate, Frida Houston, and Brenda Mitchell. After this invasion of forced removal of Indigenous people on their own territories, the Coastal GasLink workers began to remove the installation of red dresses hung to signify missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, re-victimizing all of those who had been taken and their families, as the Unistoten camp is located only 66 kilometers or about 40 miles from the infamous Highway of Tears, notorious for its connection to the disappearance and murder of Indigenous women in so-called British Columbia, some of whom had a direct connection to the Unistoten. So to give you an update about what's happening now, the police and security presence on Wet'suwet'en territory has been constant since last February's invasion by the RCMP. And today the territory is still monitored daily by police and private security officers, despite calls from the United Nations for police and security forces to withdraw. So now, about a year later, the hereditary chiefs still oppose the pipeline, but their priorities have shifted to caring for their elders and holding funerals during this pandemic. And in BC's north, First Nations people have been disproportionately hit with COVID-19, with double the confirmed cases as the rest of the population. And several First Nation communities, including Wet'suwet'en villages, have set up checkpoints to try and control the spread of the disease. And this disease is particularly damaging to our communities due to a lack of resources and past trauma. If you recall our history of being decimated by biological warfare during the smallpox epidemic between 1492 and 1600, 90% of the Indigenous populations in the Americas had been killed due to violence and never before seen pathogens like smallpox, measles, and influenza. So while the pandemic has slowed the pace of construction at the Coastal GasLink pipeline, in December, there were several COVID-19 outbreaks among employees at 2 pipeline work camps, totaling 71 workers who tested positive for the coronavirus. Coastal GasLink is now seeking permission to increase the number of personnel to complete work before the spring thaw, which is happening right now. So if finished, this pipeline will carry natural gas across 622 rivers, creeks, streams, and lakes. So I don't really know what English words to use to explain how we are a part of the land. And what happens to the land happens to our people. So we're taught, where I'm from, we're taught that we are fluid with nature and that there is no border between where our bodies end and the natural world begins. So hold on one second. Okay, so we are one. And as Indigenous people, we are stewards to this land, and we have an obligation to uphold that commitment and protect our people and our homelands. So settler colonial violence is something Indigenous people are all too familiar with, and many of you may be more familiar with Standing Rock and the ongoing opposition of the Dakota Access Pipeline, which garnered worldwide attention through the use of social media as well as mainstream media. And as we're often referred to as protesters, I really do prefer the word protectors over protesters. So these people pictured here, they are protectors, they're water protectors, land protectors, and protectors of our own bodies. And this movement began in early 2016 in reaction to the approved construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline in the northern United States. And this pipeline constitutes a serious threat to the region's water, as the 1,200-mile-long pipeline transporting crude oil will run under the Missouri Reservoir called Lake Oahe, damaging sacred sites near the lake and violating tribal treaty rights. So the mass opposition to the build of the pipelines came to head when North Dakota governor activated the National Guard to assist local law enforcement that had been monitoring the protectors. And in November, which is considered to be this country's Native American Heritage Month, law enforcement used tear gas, rubber bullets, and water cannons aimed at the crowds of protectors as temperatures began to drop below freezing. As you can see the icicles on the razor wire in one of these photos. So I know we're supposed to be talking primarily about fashion in this discussion, but as we continue to unpack these movements that have led to expressions of solidarity through fashion, it's just incredibly important that we continually hold ourselves accountable on the information our work as artists is being informed by. Because aesthetics without information is simply tokenization and co-option. So I want to quickly stitch together all the information that I've been giving you and take you back into the realm of fashion and resistance and take you guys to the 2019 Whitney Biennial, an exhibition that's held to promote up-and-coming artists at the Whitney Museum of American Art here in New York City. And the year 2019 was a record number of Indigenous artists. So on opening day, Anishinaabe artist Maria Hupfeld and Mississippi Choctaw artist and historian Regan DeLoggins walked into the exhibit, both donning red outfits from head to toe. Maria's one-of-a-kind red dress was draped around her shoulders, and she wore 20 antler bone whistles as necklaces. Once inside the exhibit, Maria began blowing the whistles, as she says, to signal like a referee or a sonic experience, languages other than words to speak to all beings. Maria and Regan began unwrapping Maria's dress to unveil a banner stating, "Demilitarize our art, people over profit." Hupfield and DeLoggins, both members of the Indigenous Kinship Collective, played a hand drum alongside other sound creations and read a statement from the collective calling for the removal of Whitney Museum board member Warren Kanders, stating, "Indigenous people and other people of color are violently under attack by Warren Kanders' manufactured weapons of terrorism." So who is Warren Kanders? In addition to being a board member of the Whitney Museum, he is also the CEO of Safariland. a global defense manufacturer that arms police forces with chemical and tactical weapons against protesters, including those at Standing Rock, those in Ferguson, Missouri, those crossing the US-Mexico border, during Black Lives Matter protests, all the way to supplying the Israeli Defense Force with bullets that were fired into crowds of Palestinian refugees demonstrating in Gaza. And this action not only brought attention to Indigenous voices in the forefront of the art world through the form of fashion, but it drove home the commitment our people uphold to be protectors. And Maria Hupfeld later stated, "I don't want to be instrumentalized as an artist, and I'm so aware politically of how often that can be the case. I think it's just really rough to see a lot of Native artists being included in the biennial, while at the same time there's a board member who is targeting our communities." Kanders later stepped down from his position on the Whitney board and has come under fire yet again for his supply of tear gas used during the recent uprising of protests against racial injustice. So, to give you an update on Dakota Access Pipeline, the oil in the pipeline is still flowing for now, but its fate is in question as the decision on whether or not the pipeline will be allowed to keep operating has been pushed back to April 9th. So we can put that on our calendars too, April 9th. Some activists feel optimistic given the Biden administration's recent decision to revoke the Keystone XL pipeline's permit, but others are skeptical as actions are still being held in opposition. So this brings us now into the Senate and the recent confirmation hearing of Deb Haaland to lead the Department of the Interior, which will come to a final vote on Monday. So Deb Haaland, who is a member of the Laguna Pueblo in New Mexico, would be the first Indigenous person to manage the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Bureau of Indian Education, both a part of the Department of the Interior. And she would also oversee more than 480 million acres of public lands and nearly a dozen federal agencies, including the National Park Service. So during the confirmation hearing, Haaland was repeatedly questioned by Republicans on her stances against the oil and natural gas industry and whether she supported the shutdown of the Keystone XL pipeline. And Haaland stated simply, after many attempts to pigeonhole her, if I say I support President Biden's agenda, I assume you could take my answer as yes. So Haaland supported protesters who stood against construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline and has advocated for greater focus on renewable energy. But I want to hone in on Haaland's fashion choices and the possible correlation between her choice to wear red and the opposition to the oil and gas industry. At a US House of Representatives hearing on missing and murdered Indigenous women in 2019, Representative Haaland wore red. She stated, "I'm wearing red today in honor of missing and murdered Indigenous women," noting that the issue of MMIW had been a priority for her long before she had taken office. At the time, Haaland was working on several pieces of legislation that she and other members were trying to pass to address the issue of MMIW, including Savannah's Act in memory of Savannah LaFontaine Graywind, who's a pregnant 22-year-old member of the Spirit Lake Nation and who was brutally murdered by a Fargo, North Dakota neighbor in 2017. So Savannah's Act would direct the US Department of Justice to come up with new guidelines for reporting violent crimes against Indigenous people and mandates that the Attorney General and the Secretary of the Interior consult with tribes on how to further improve federal missing persons databases and tribal access to them. And on September 30th of 2020, Nancy Pelosi signed the Not Invisible Act and Savannah's Act, both bills set to address missing and murdered Indigenous women's crisis. And Deb Haaland and Norma Torres, representatives, both attended wearing red. Holland demanded all women deserve to live without fear of disappearing without a trace. But the missing and murdered Indigenous women's crisis persists, and Indigenous people continue to go missing. Congresswoman Norma Torres said, Native women have endured horrific rates of assault, rape, and murder for far too long in this country, and each life lost or scarred by violence is absolutely inexcusable. So the Not Invisible Act of 2019, if signed into law, will be the first bill in history to be introduced and passed by 4 members of federally recognized tribes, and will create an advisory committee on violent crime composed of law enforcement, tribal leaders, federal partners, service providers, and survivors to make recommendations to the Department of Interior and Department of Justice to provide best practices. Savannah's Act addresses the disturbing increase in murdered and missing and murdered Indigenous women by creating new guidelines for responding to such cases. So while we've been discussing the correlation between the build of man camps and the red dress movement, man camps and oil workers are simply one example of the cause of missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. And not all who wear red oppose the build of pipelines. And the reality is that Indigenous people face violent victimization on a multitude of platforms. And I want to be very clear that I do not speak for all Indigenous people, and to remind you all again that I can only speak from my own opinions and my own experiences. As Indigenous communities are incredibly diverse, we are not a monolith. But the commitment to protect all of our relatives is the red thread that links us all. So now that we have a pretty solid base on what the movement is, I can talk more about representation in art, media, and fashion as people move forward with a call to create greater awareness for our missing and murdered relatives. So one fashionable way to show support and awareness for the movement is to wear a single earring. And when people approach you, you can let them know, like maybe they'll approach you to let you know that you might be missing an earring, and you can let them know and use that opportunity to share information with them about missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. And another widely used symbol is the red handprint over the mouth, used to symbolize the silencing of victimized Indigenous women. And it was spotlighted in the media when athlete Whitney Biennial, a competitive runner from the Lower Brule Sioux tribe in South Dakota, prominently donned the symbol at the 2019 Boston Marathon. Daniel had dedicated her run to 26 missing or murdered Indigenous women, stating that she wanted to use her platform to bring awareness so that they were seen, heard, and remembered. In the same year, it was worn by athlete Rosalie Fish, a member of the Cowlitz tribe of Southwest Washington. And I just want to quickly note, the red handprint, it really should only be reserved for Indigenous communities. While it is an act of solidarity, there's a lot of controversy over using it. And I think you have to be really careful of how you express awareness, particularly in this movement. So I would just leave the red handprint to Indigenous people. So it was also famously used by Alona Verley, who wore a traditional jingle dress and the red handprint to create further awareness. And Verley was Drag Race's first two-spirit contestant on the reality show Canada's Drag Race. And she put it perfectly when she said in a Vogue interview, "I can sit and talk about being Indigenous until I'm blue in the face, but people are visual learners," justifying the use of these visuals in order to create awareness and change. So the visual symbols of awareness surrounding this movement are now widespread, proving to the masses that we are not invisible. And the red dress movement has inspired countless works of art and solidarity sub-movements. From earrings to paintings to murals to podcasts to webinars to makeup to stickers to phone cases to slogan tees to masks. And the artist's response to create awareness is inevitable. So we live in an extremely visual time, and this idea of content creation is so prevalent, it feels at times like it defines our worth and our work. And with the use of social media, we've been able to generate these kinds of conversations on a mass scale. And through our clothing, we're able to express who we are and what we stand for in a matter of seconds. So the commodification of these pivotal movements was pretty much inevitable. Vanessa Friedman of the New York Times wrote, "Capitalist opportunities often emerge from times of trauma. That doesn't make the origin stories any less uncomfortable." So because fashion is so inherently tied to capitalism, exploitation, and pollution, many people think that fashion exists so far outside of the form of art that when we tell stories through design, we're not really considered artists. And while I want to challenge that conception, designers walk an extremely fine line between expression and selling a movement. The red dress movement has now entered countless runways and photo shoots with the intention of spreading awareness. Because the movement began as a single red dress hanging empty, it already existed as a piece of fashion. So Patricia Michaels, Justas Pueblo, dedicated her 2019 SWAIA, which is Southwestern Association for Indian Arts, finale to MMIW. She worked with children in her community to sculpt paper mache moccasins, as each moccasin had the letter I painted on the bottom to symbolize how cold cases are filed under I for Indian. And the models walked the runway, doused in red light, as faces of Indigenous women from the community shown on the screens. Patricia says that she often uses her platform to bring awareness to Indigenous issues. Another Indigenous designer, Leslie Hampton, who is Anishinaabe and Mohawk, recently came under scrutiny after her 2019 collection showcased at Toronto Fashion Week. Its intention was to bring awareness of the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, but it actually ended up deeply offending surviving family members. And Hampton said that she never intended the piece to be triggering, but instead create a spotlight in a traditionally white-dominated world of fashion. The dress, which featured countless red dots, was intended to represent those who have been stolen, but surviving family members spoke out saying the dots were triggering against the sheer fabric, as if they symbolized blood. Hampton apologized for the dress, stating, "Those feelings are completely valid, and I'm disappointed in myself that I didn't see the possible triggers in my work prior to releasing it. This critique allows me to grow as an artist and develop better work in the future." So Deborah Green, whose sister, 23-year-old Lainey Ewan's murder remains unsolved, Green stated, "It represents disrespect and not putting families first, and that the red dresses aren't meant to be used as a platform for their pain, and going on to explain that the dress should not be hanging on models or mannequins, that they are intended to hang alone in trees to represent and honor those stolen. So my intention coming into class was to share multiple examples of how fashion can be used as resistance. But as I continued to work, the information that inspired this movement became so much more important than just talking about the visuals, especially in a movement that's so widespread. Because if the story surrounding missing and murdered Indigenous relatives were my entire body, the last hour maybe only accounted for a fingernail size of information. But I also really wanted to focus on this movement as a specific case study into the use of fashion in social movements, and this timeline from trauma to action to awareness to exploitation. So what I want to hammer home to you all is how incredibly nuanced this idea of fashion and resistance is through the lens of a capitalist society. As many fashion-based movements like the red dress, like the hoodie sweatshirt that was used as a visual protest in solidarity with the unjust killing of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin, or the use of wearing white as a color of solidarity in the feminist movement, or how we saw political leaders donning purple from head to toe during the inauguration to represent unity. These are all visual stories that we tell about ourselves and what we stand for. So today, as we continue to uphold each other and hold each other accountable, and people are calling us to put our money where our mouth is, I want everyone to consider the good and bad outcomes when we talk about fashion. With brands now creating uninformed and stunted enlightenment as the fashion industry begins to woke wash their products in order to gain capital through trauma. So this is another fine line because yes, supporting small people of color owned businesses is important to our economic sovereignty, or supporting designers whose morals, ethics, and production practices align with yours, but we need to continue to do our research. Because the bottom line is buying a handbag that says end systemic racism will not end systemic racism. Buying a mass-produced shirt on Amazon that says Black Lives Matter will not stop police violence and murder. And buying a coffee cup that says save the planet will not save the planet. So this co-option of movements for aesthetics is not enough to create lasting change. And I could argue that it's just creating more waste. We don't need more stuff. We need more actions. And I want to end class by asking you all this question again, because as a designer, I ask myself this question every day. Can fashion be used as a medium for social and environmental change? Hoya Chud, I'm finished. So thank you all for being here today and attending this class on fashion and resistance. And I really appreciate you all taking this time with me. And next week on March 19th, we will be having a class on fashion and prison labor, which I'm really excited about. It's an incredibly important conversation for us to all to have. And that class will be taught by Teju Adisa Farrar. So I guess, I don't know how long I've been talking, but I guess we can start with questions.
Korina, so Janet is asking, I am a Wiharika Indigenous woman born and raised in California. What do you think about the separation of Indigenous people from Mexico to the native groups in US and Canada?
I think about it in the same way that I think about when I say that there's no borders between where our bodies end and the natural world begins. These invisible lines that were created to separate us and categorize us. I'm from the Northwest, you know, and the border between Canada and the US was not in existence, right? Like when my family was there just like thriving and chilling in Coast Salish territories. So it's super weird to me, the borders. And I think that the instances of femicide in Latin American communities really do mirror this conversation of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. So yeah, I guess, I think the borders are dumb. If that answers it.
Yes, and I would agree with that final statement. An anonymous attendee is saying, "Your garments are remarkable." I also second that. Their question is, do you design specifically for Indigenous folks, and how can non-Indigenous folks wear your garments without it being seen as cultural appropriation?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's really actually interesting. In the first semester, we covered this topic. I hosted a class on cultural appropriation with a few other Indigenous designers and educators. And the simplest answer is like, I would never put something online for sale that wasn't available for everyone to wear. Okay, so like if I was to make something specifically for Indigenous people, I wouldn't be posting it online. I wouldn't be sharing it with everyone. So what I make is intentionally created to share amongst all people. And I don't think that you'll ever be accused of cultural appropriation. And I think it was Adrienne Keene who said it best when she said, what is the fear of people accusing you of cultural appropriation if you're wearing a garment made by an Indigenous designer? Because then it just opens up a conversation. If somebody does say something to you, you can just say, oh, like this is Korina Emmerich and she's Puyallup and da da da. And it's, yeah, it's a good way. So yes, my designs are for everyone. I wouldn't sell things online that weren't.
Thank you. And I love what you said about peace being a conversation opener and how people should know the information behind the designer and the garment that they're wearing so that it can have that function of informing those around us.
Mm-hmm.
Samantha Nackman says, you use the word Indian to refer to Indigenous people in this class a few times. I'm wondering why that is if we have been taught to recognize Indigenous as Native Americans rather than Indians, seeking better understanding.
Totally, that's a really good question. My use of the word Indian was mostly in quotations or in the use of like the Urban Indian Health Institute, or if we're talking about the Southwestern Indian Association of Indian Arts. And I believe that those are outdated terms, so that's not really something that I choose to use in my language. But again, that goes back to the conversation that our people are not a monolith. So some people still do use that term. And some people have a really serious problem with it. So it just goes back to who you're speaking to. I do personally prefer Indigenous, but if we're going to go down to brass taxes, whatever that means, I'd say I would prefer to be referred to by my tribal affiliation, right? So I'm Puyallup, but I don't expect everybody to understand and recognize all the individual tribes, but it just goes to show how diverse the communities are and how different that we all are. So it's really based down to each individual's preference on what they use. And it is a word that is still prominently used in institutions that are in Indian country, right? So.
Okay, I think this is a great question to round out today's Q&A by an anonymous attendee again. We often talk about raising awareness, resistance, and self-education, but how important is direct action? When the state and corporations are using violence to displace Indigenous peoples and take land, how important is it to actually fight back?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly important, right? I don't want to expose myself too much in my views on these types of things. I think direct action is incredibly important. If we think about what happened during the Dakota Access pipeline build and at the Standing Rock protests, you know, it's like, what is our opposition? Our opposition is a National Guard, water cannons, rubber bullets, and tear gas when everybody that was at Standing Rock was unarmed and peaceful. So if we think about going ahead, how do you fight somebody who doesn't have a conscience, right? Especially when we talk about sustainability and climate justice. I think that the call for solidarity for people who believe in sustainable fashion, who believe in sustainable this or that really needs to start supporting Indigenous movements, because it is our job to uphold the commitments that we have to protect land, water, resources, people. And I think that because we do get so caught up in aesthetics and social media and this kind of idea of slacktivism, right? Where it's like, awareness is not the end goal, right? So awareness is a part of it, but action, like I had said, we don't need more stuff, we need more action. So I do think direct action is incredibly important. And that's like really a whole nother class, like to talk about. But I will say, yes, direct action is incredibly important in addition to creating awareness. And awareness is not the end of movements. Action will always be the end of movements.
Thank you so much, Korina. That was so beautiful, and this entire class has been so enlightening. I'd love to just, leave the floor to you for any closing words for today's class.
Oh yeah, thank you. I guess I'll just say, Hoyaf Chud, I'm finished, and how it took show up. And thank you all so much. And yeah, I'm just like so grateful for everyone for coming and being in these classes, and I'm just so grateful to see these changes happening and people taking action to just show up. So thank you all so much. Okay, thank you.